3 decisions, 3 countries, 24 hours. And when you understand what just happened, not just what was announced, but what was really set in motion, you'll realize that the world that existed yesterday no longer exists today. Stay with me, because one of these moves, just one, would be headline news for a month. Trump made all 3 before sunset. It started before most people were awake. A quiet announcement, no press conference, no dramatic speech, just a memo. And 5,000 American soldiers in Germany suddenly didn't know what their future looked like. By noon, the situation had escalated. The word from the White House on Iran wasn't a warning. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was something closer to a door being slammed shut, and by evening, a country 90 miles from American soil heard the most direct threat it has received from the United States in decades. 3 moves, 3 countries. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a question that nobody in Washington, London, or Brussels can answer right now. Where does this end? We're going to break down all 3, not just what happened, but what it means, what it sets in motion, and what it tells us about the next chapter of American foreign policy under Donald Trump. Let me give you some context before we talk about what just happened, because this decision doesn't exist in a vacuum. For nearly 80 years, the United States has kept a military presence in Germany since the end of World War II, through the Cold War, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, through the reunification of Europe, through every single geopolitical shift on that continent. American soldiers have been there. That's not just a military arrangement, that's a statement. It says, we are here. We are committed. You are not alone. 5,000 soldiers were just removed from that statement. Now, some people will say, 5,000 isn't that many? And in terms of raw numbers, they're right. The United States still has tens of thousands of troops stationed across Europe. But that's not the point. The point is the signal. When NATO leaders woke up to this news, the first question wasn't, how many soldiers? The first question was, why now? Why, in the middle of an already unstable European security environment, would the United States pull troops from one of its most strategically critical allies? The second question, and this one is being asked in every European capital right now, is, who's next? Because if Germany isn't safe from this kind of withdrawal, Germany, the economic heart of Europe, America's oldest post-war ally, then nobody is. The European response was swift, and it reveals something important. Within hours, senior EU officials were calling for exactly what the United States has been demanding for years: greater European self-defense, more spending, more independence, less reliance on American military guarantees. On the surface, that sounds like a good thing. Allies becoming more self-sufficient. But here's what that actually means in practice. A Europe that builds its own military independence is a Europe that starts making its own decisions, its own alliances, its own calculations about Russia, about China, about the Middle East. A Europe that no longer assumes the United States will always be there. That shift, if it happens, would be the most significant change to the Western security order since the Cold War ended. And it may have just started with a memo about 5,000 soldiers. We'll come back to what this means for the bigger picture. But first, because what's happening in Iran right now cannot wait. Here's what you need to understand about the Iran situation as of right now. For months, the world has been watching a slow, painful, high-stakes negotiation between Washington and Tehran. Sanctions, uranium enrichment, nuclear thresholds, back-channel communications. The kind of diplomacy that happens in hotel rooms in Oman and Vienna, away from cameras, where the real decisions get made. And throughout all of that, there was a shared assumption. From both sides, from analysts, from America's allies in the region, that a deal was possible. Difficult maybe, Painful for both sides, definitely, but possible. That assumption may have just died. Donald Trump said something that diplomats around the world stopped and read twice. He suggested, openly, publicly, without the diplomatic language that usually cushions these statements, that the United States might be better off not making a deal with Iran at all. Think about what that means. Not, the current deal isn't good enough. Not, we need better terms. Not, we're walking away from the table temporarily. Better off without a deal. Period. That's not a negotiating position, that's a conclusion. And when the most powerful military force on Earth reaches a conclusion that a deal isn't worth having, the next question isn't about diplomacy anymore. Here's the context that makes this even more significant. Iran has been accelerating its nuclear program. International inspectors have documented levels of uranium enrichment that are, by any technical definition, very close to weapons grade. Not there yet, but close enough that the timeline is measured in months, not years. The United States and Israel have both said, repeatedly, clearly on the record, that they will not allow Iran to become a nuclear power. So here's where we are. Iran is accelerating. The window for a deal is closing. The President of the United States just said maybe a deal isn't even the goal. And American military assets in the region have been repositioned in recent weeks in ways that military analysts describe as pre-conflict posturing. That's not my characterization. That's what the analysts are saying. Now, I want to be very careful here because there's a difference between a situation that looks dangerous and a situation that actually becomes dangerous. These are not the same thing. And history is full of moments that looked like the edge of war and pulled back. But here's what I can tell you. The margin for error right now is the smallest it's been in years. One miscalculation, one incident at sea, one air defense system that fires when it shouldn't, one decision made in a moment of fear or pride rather than strategy. That's all it takes, and both sides know it. The question that nobody can answer right now, and I mean nobody, not the analysts, not the diplomats, not the people who brief the president every morning, is whether Donald Trump has already made a decision that hasn't been announced yet. Because sometimes when a president says maybe we're better off without a deal, that's the end of the conversation. And sometimes it's the beginning of something else entirely. We'll come back to what that something else might look like. But first, I need to tell you about Cuba. Because what happened there in the last 24 hours is being called, by the Cuban government itself, an unprecedented threat. 90 miles. That's the distance between the coast of Florida and the island of Cuba. You could drive it in under 2 hours if there were a road. For decades, that 90 miles has been one of the most politically charged distances on Earth. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, the embargo. Generations of tension, proxy conflicts, and failed negotiations compressed into a gap you could almost throw a baseball across. And in the last 24 hours, Donald Trump made a statement about Cuba that hasn't been made by an American president. Not like this, not this directly. In modern history, he said the United States will take control of Cuba. Not we support regime change in Cuba. Not we are increasing pressure on the Cuban government. Not the careful diplomatic language that American presidents have used for 60 years when discussing their island neighbor. Take control. The Cuban government's response was immediate. They called it unprecedented. They called it a threat. They called it a violation of every principle of international sovereignty. And then they did something interesting. They didn't just protest. They called on the international community to respond, to recognize what they described as an existential threat from a neighboring superpower. That's a very specific diplomatic move. When a small country calls on the international community, when they frame something not just as a bilateral dispute, but as a global issue, they're trying to build a coalition. They're trying to make sure that if something happens, they are not alone. That's what a country does when it's afraid. Now, let's put this in context, because context matters enormously here. Cuba in 2025 is not the Cuba of the Cold War. It's not the Cuba that had Soviet nuclear missiles pointed at American cities. The geopolitical chess match that made Cuba so strategically critical has changed completely. But Cuba still matters. And it matters for a reason that doesn't get talked about enough. Cuba has been quietly deepening its relationships with exactly the countries that the United States views as its primary adversaries: Russia, China, Iran, naval visits, intelligence cooperation, economic agreements that, on the surface, look like trade deals, but that military analysts read very differently. Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, has become something of a listening post, a strategic foothold, a place where America's adversaries can operate with a proximity that makes American defense planners very, very uncomfortable. So when Trump says, take control of Cuba, the question isn't just about Cuba. The question is, what does he know? What has American intelligence told him about what's happening on that island? What level of foreign military activity, Russian, Chinese, Iranian, has crossed a threshold that triggered this response? Because presidents don't make statements like this randomly. They make them when they've decided something, when they've seen something, when a line has been crossed that the public doesn't know about yet. At least, that's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that this is pressure, designed to frighten, to force the Cuban government into a choice: distance yourself from Russia and China, or face consequences you're not prepared for. Both interpretations lead to the same question: what happens if Cuba doesn't comply? Here's what I want you to see, because most of the coverage of these three stories treats them as separate. They're not. They're three moves in the same game. Think about it. Pulling troops from Germany sends a message to Europe. You need to defend yourselves. Stop assuming America will always be there. Stop making decisions about your security based on a guarantee we may not honor forever. That forces Europe to make choices, to spend money on defense, to build alliances, to become a more independent military power. An independent Europe is a Europe that Russia has to deal with differently. It changes the calculations on Ukraine. It changes what Putin can and cannot assume. And when Putin's assumptions change, so do Iran's. Because Iran's position in the Middle East has always been partly dependent on Russia's position in the global order. They are not formal allies, but they are aligned. What weakens one shifts the other. Now add Cuba. Cuba is the piece on the board closest to American territory. If Trump can control the situation in Cuba, if he can remove Russian and Chinese influence from 90 miles off the Florida coast, he eliminates a vulnerability. He closes a gap that his adversaries have been quietly exploiting for years. Three moves, three countries, but one strategic logic running through all of them. The question, and this is the question that keeps analysts up at night, is whether this is a coordinated strategy with a clear endgame, or whether it's a series of aggressive moves that create more instability than they resolve. Because here's the risk. When you pull troops from Germany, Europe becomes uncertain. Uncertainty creates vulnerability. Vulnerability can be exploited. When you walk away from an Iran deal and position military assets nearby, you create a situation where a single mistake can trigger a conflict nobody planned for. When you threaten to take control of a sovereign nation 90 miles from your coast, you hand your adversaries a perfect propaganda victory. You give Russia and China a perfect example to show the world. See, this is what America does. Every action has a reaction. Every move has a counter move. And right now the board is more crowded and more dangerous than it's been in a very long time. So where does this go? In the next 72 hours, watch for three things. First, watch Germany. Watch how NATO responds formally to the troop withdrawal. If the official response is measured and diplomatic, the alliance is holding. If individual countries start making independent security arrangements, direct deals outside the NATO framework, the fracture is real. Second, watch Iran. Specifically, watch whether Tehran responds to Trump's "better without a deal" comment with escalation or with silence. Silence from Iran usually means one of two things. They're calculating, or they've already made a decision. Neither one is reassuring. Third, watch Cuba. Watch whether any foreign military assets, ships, aircraft, personnel quietly leave Cuban territory in the next few days. If they do, the threat worked. If they don't, then we have a situation. There is one more thing I haven't told you yet, and it connects all three of these stories in a way that changes how you understand everything I've just explained. There's a report, not confirmed, not official, but coming from sources that have been accurate before, about a private communication that happened between Washington and Moscow in the last 48 hours. Before the Germany announcement, before the Iran statement, before the Cuba declaration, a communication that, if the contents are what multiple sources are suggesting, would explain why Trump made all three of these moves in the same 24-hour window, not as separate decisions, as one decision. I'll be covering that in the next video, because what's allegedly in that communication, if it's confirmed, is the kind of thing that reframes everything, not just these three stories, the last 6 months. What you've just watched is not a complete picture. It can't be, because the picture isn't complete yet. History doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a press release when the critical moment arrives. It only becomes clear later, when you can look back and see exactly where the turning point was. We may be living inside one of those turning points right now. What I can tell you is this: the decisions being made in Washington, Tehran, Havana, and Brussels in the next 72 hours will matter. They will matter for years. Pay attention. If you want to understand what comes next, not the headlines, but the strategy behind them, subscribe. Because the next video covers the private communication between Washington and Moscow that made all of this make sense. Drop a comment below. Which of these three moves do you think is the most dangerous? Germany, Iran, or Cuba? I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next video.